In episode 71 of Mobycast, Jon and Chris discuss lessons learned while working with remote and international engineering teams. Welcome to Mobycast, a weekly conversation about cloud-native development, AWS, and building distributed systems. Let's jump right in.
Welcome, Chris and Rich. It's another episode of Mobycast.
Hey
guys, good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back. So today, I think we're just going to jump right into it because this episode is less talking about technical details and more about some storytelling. We want to get into some of the transitions that Chris has gone through, moving through his career and starting to work with Kelsys, starting to work with remote and overseas teams. And I think that a lot of our listeners, and Rich, you've been looking at some of our analytics more than I have, but I think a lot of our listeners are from overseas and maybe work remotely, and this is the audience we're talking to. So I think we want to talk directly to you today. Is that right, Rich?
I actually don't know. I can probably find that out as we go through this, but that is a good question.
Okay, so maybe I have been paying more attention to analytics than I let on. It's true.
Okay.
Hello, international listeners. Thank you for listening. Yeah, so I have done my career largely working with international teams, and that started in 2001 at a company called StorePerform. We had a US-based team, and it was a really high-performing team. Some of the people at that team are now CTOs at major hedge funds that you would have heard of. They're chief architects at NASDAQ. You know, these people were excellent. One of them is a chief architect at Twitter. I mean, really, really good developers on this one team that I worked for in 2001. And while I was there, though, the leadership of that company was Indian. And so that guy, Srikant Vasan, decided that he wanted to have a team in India because that's where he had come from. And he just felt like he wanted to pay back a little bit from where he had come. And I volunteered to go there and hire a team. And this in 2001, that was really early for doing that in Bangalore. When I visited, I didn't see any other people that were sort of on that trip doing the same thing that I was doing, and it was very easy to find people. I went back 2 years later in 2003, and it was not that way at all. And I haven't been back since, but I would imagine that if I were to go there now, I wouldn't even recognize the place. It would just be, Silicon Valley of India. Anyway, I don't want to make this too long of a story about myself, but the point I want to make in that is that after I hired the team in India, what we found is that we had two entirely different teams. We had one high-performing team and one very low-performing team. And I'm not blaming the team in India. It's just it was just a fact. We had a good one and a bad one. And so since then, I in my career have worked with different teams all over the world. I've worked with teams in Nepal, teams in Thailand, teams in South America. And I've finally landed with Kelsys and building a team that I've been working with for the last 11 years that I would claim is a high-performing team. They're a very good team. And Chris came into this a couple of years ago with a sort of an entire career's worth of working with and in and managing high-performing teams. And so this was a bit of it was a journey for him switching from working inside US teams to working with a remote team. And he has been instrumental in taking the Kelsys team from, mid to high to extremely high performing. And Chris, I just want to talk to you about that experience about switching from working in US-based teams to working with Kelsys. So I guess let me start by asking you a question. What did you expect? What were your expectations coming in?
Mm-hmm. I get just the TLDR would be I expected the unexpected, really. I really didn't know what to expect in that this was a new experience at least two ways, right? One was completely virtual company, which was somewhat new for me. I had worked in completely virtual companies before. My bootstrap startup was a virtual company, but that was all with folks that I'd worked with in person before, right? So a little bit different.
Do you even work for Kelsys, Chris? We are not a completely virtual company. We have an actual office with people that show up every day in Resistencia, Argentina, and another office in Corrientes, Argentina.
It's virtual to me, from my perspective, right? So it's just a matter of what lens you're looking for. But absolutely, yeah, we actually do have leases and physical office space.
And I just bring that up because in my own experience, I've been to those offices twice now, I think. And it just blows my mind when I go there. It's like, what? This company, that I founded 11 years ago has offices? Okay, I guess we have offices. It's always surprising.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Indeed. So that was one major difference, being a virtual team, and then the other part being dealing with non-US developers. So I'd had some experience with that at previous company, but more just tangentially. Like I said, I had worked a couple company positions ago, worked for a mobile software development company. It was on the larger side for me. It was probably about 600-700 people when I joined. They had recently gone public. They were still a pretty young company, but kind of growing quickly. Engineering team was probably like 20-30 people big when I joined there at the offices that I was at. But it turns out we actually had like a whole offshore development team in India, and actually growing that. But for me, it was a bit of a black box. It was always kind of a mystery.
And that's so typical. So often companies just keep the teams separated. Oh yeah, there's that dark works team somewhere else that's overseas or in Eastern Europe or India or Bangladesh or some other place, China. And the developers in the US don't even know what they do. And I think that's sort of terrible, honestly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was not a good experience for me, and it didn't give me a high degree of confidence in that model, just because, I didn't know what they were doing and why they were doing it, and then they were working totally different hours, right? So it's like I would come in the morning and see the result of what had happened over the previous night, and now the build would fail, right? And like it was just major spelling errors and
right.
code, right? And it was just like, what's going on here? Like, this is not like, are we really, paying for this? This doesn't seem like a really great deal. So,
right. And that just to interrupt you again, like that was my initial experience at StorePerform too. Even though I went and created a team, I think that people within the company that were above me, that were sort of, VPs of engineering or CTOs or whatever, were trying to take care of the feelings of the US developers who sort of didn't want that team to exist and were pretty vocal about it. So they were just sort of like, yeah, John, just you do the India stuff and make sure that, it doesn't really impact the US stuff very much, and just keep them separate. And so that was my job. And I could tell that it just wasn't working. And that's, already a lesson learned. If you're going to do this, creating an us versus them situation with your remote teams is a good way to fail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're definitely hitting a very real issue there. And I think it kind of just goes with some of like the industry itself, especially, US developers. There's this kind of like this feeling of like, we're the best in the world, right? Like we are the only world-class developers out there, and that, we're worth the most money. We have the best salaries, the highest rates, and that, if you go and hire a remote team or an international team or offshore or nearshore, whatever, it costs less and it's not as good, right? And so that whole mentality, I think, is in place. And I think kind of like what you were describing there is just kind of like dealing with that, right? And managing, like there's going to be there's the management's perception or fear that the US based team there's going to be morale issues, or there's going to be just perception issues, right? With like this work that's being done by these other teams. And so there's not an integration, right? It's trying to like build that wall between them. So it's almost like, don't worry, there's nothing going on over here, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is not how the business sees it. So it's incorrect.
Yes.
So that was left a kind of a bad taste in your mouth. And then another experience that I specifically recall with you was when we were working together very early on, where your company was a client of Kelsys, not directly. Kelsys was actually subcontracting for a different company that I shall not mention. So you and I were working together, and I remember specifically you sent me an email or a message or something that said, hey, what's up with this code? And it was some code that a guy that still works with Kelsys named Fede had written, and it was like 100 characters long on a line of like lots of weird null checking or something, and it was just kind of ugly to read. And I just remember being like, oh, wow, Chris is reading our code. What's going on with that? Because that was unique for Kelsys. Can you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it may have even happened, a few times. I mean, my role there was, I was the primary interface, with you and that team, and I was writing most of the back end, the back end services, the API, and your team was building the mobile client. And so, at the end of the day, I was on the hook for the quality, making sure that this whole thing worked end to end, right? And so part of that was just I was doing a lot of testing and using of that app, and so getting the new builds of it, looking at it, and of course we have access to the code base, right? So, to this day, like I may not do code reviews of all the code that's coming through, but definitely looking at diffs, even just really quickly, right? And there's
You're like the TSA random signaler of Kelsis.
kind of, right? And so, and it's one of those things where it's like, there's certain things that just always kind of like stick out. And so I think that was, in that particular case that you're talking about, I think that was actually it was a bug that was causing a problem. And then I went and looked at the diff, and what I saw was, I was like, oh, come on. This is not good, right?
5 years ago. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I just remember seeing that and being like, whoa, because I knew that you were not an iOS developer, so I really didn't expect you to be looking at the iOS code. And, the other thing was sort of like, I wasn't even reviewing Fede's code myself. I was just kind of like doing some testing, some black box testing, but I wasn't looking at his code. And it kind of was like this, like, come on, Jon, like, you know better. Like, you should be helping out Fede and the other people on the team and looking at their code and giving them examples of what to do. And my prior experience, I had seen that whenever I would write code, or, there's another guy that we worked with a lot named Kevin Barnes, whenever he would write code, all of a sudden the code of the rest of the team would start to look a lot more like mine or like Kevin's. And I was like, okay, so the team is learning by example. And all of a sudden Chris jumps in and he's like a new example. And he sort of shocked me with his quick, mastery of Objective-C, which is pretty opaque language. Like if you've never looked at Objective-C and you look at it for the first time, it's kind of hard to tell what function call even is. And so first was his quick mastery of that. And second was like, he was really paying attention to our quality. And so I knew that we couldn't just kind of wing it with Nuku and Chris on the team. And that one moment led to eventually Chris joining Kelsis. Like if you had not done that, I don't think we would have ever worked together. Mm-hmm. Isn't that wild?
Yeah. For sure. you never, you never know, like the paths you go down and what will loop back around and whatnot.
Right. And it was you doing some feedback that ended up, creating this great respect, right? Like, Chris is really with it. So then you join us, and you, as you said already, you knew to expect the unexpected. And I think your first experience really working with us was actually meeting everybody in person. Can you tell me what you're like? How did that impact you? What was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, timing worked out pretty nice, right? Because I joined in January. I had a couple weeks of getting settled in the team and kind of now working on this virtual team and really interacting day to day via video calls with this team that's down in Argentina. But then about 3 weeks later, we had an offsite in person where we all met down in Uruguay. And so I got to meet everyone face to face, right? And spend a week down there with folks, getting to know them and their families and whatnot. So from a timing standpoint, very, very fortuitous. It helped establish those bonds, those relationships, kind of understanding some of the nuances, the cultural differences and whatnot. And it was just a great experience for me, for sure.
Right. I think one of the things that I recall you telling me, and maybe you were just sort of like being nice to the new sort of boss or whatever, because that was sort of the beginning of us working together. But you said to me something more or less along the lines of, I really haven't had the experience where I like spending time and like being around my fellow colleagues before. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I was totally lying. No. I mean, and I meant it, right? I mean, it's, I think this really goes to some of the really great advantages that I've come to appreciate of working with international teams, and especially, our team in Argentina, is just the cultural differences. Here in the US, I mean, I've worked on very, stressful, high performing, high demanding teams where, it's kind of like you're competing against your fellow developers, right? There's very real money on the line. Your career's on the line, stock options, bonuses. I mean, you are stack ranked against each other. So it really kind of creates this culture of like, it's, pitting you against each other. And so it's like you're in that kind of a really high stress frenzied environment. It's like the last thing in the world I want to do is go hang out with these kind of people right at the movies or something like that. Because again, I mean, it kind of makes, I mean, you don't want to establish, I mean, it kind of discourages those emotional connections, right? The empathy, it very much dissuades that. So
right. But really the real players in a team like that do create those close bonds and then undercut each other.
The backstabbers. Yeah. I mean, which is, so yeah, so there's all that, right?
Yeah.
And, you can play the politics game and whatnot. Like, I'm not good at that. It just feels so wrong, to do that.
Hey, this is Rich. Please pardon this quick interruption. We recently passed an internal milestone of 50,000 listens, and I wanted to take a moment to thank you for the support. I was also hoping to encourage you to head over to iTunes and leave us a review and/or a rating. Positive feedback and constructive criticism are both incredibly important to us. So give us an idea of how we're doing, and we'll promise to keep publishing new episodes every week. Okay, let's dive back in.
So, with coming up to speed, meeting the team in Argentina, the thing that just really struck me is like that is not the kind of culture that they have. I mean, it's very much it's a we instead of an I type philosophy. It's very much they love just being with each other and working together, and the wins are celebrated as group wins, not as individual wins. They don't see each other as adversaries, right? They truly see themselves as just a group of people, and to I think to a huge extent, like friends come first, then work, and not to say that they don't work hard, right? Or they're very much a high growth mindset. They love to learn and collaborate. It's just a different cultural feel to it. So
you just mentioned something. Sorry, Chris. You just mentioned something about celebrating wins as group wins, and literally today, I was just talking to Fede, and I was like, you know what? They're doing a direct messaging feature for ZooPix, which is going to be awesome. It's going to be so cool for people in ZooPix to be able to just have conversations with each other outside the public view. But it's been a bear, and I just know that it's kind of been a drag for everyone. And so I was like, Fede, when you finish that, maybe you should have a celebration for the team. And then it just occurred to me, I was like, oh, and maybe you should just include everybody else in the company too. And Fede was like, that would be awesome. And it was like, yes, of course you have to include the whole company, because that's just how it works. Like, you can't have the ZooPix team celebrating off by themselves. Like, it's a company win.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I realize I interrupted you, and I don't remember exactly what the next point you were trying to make, but we're on this thing of like your first impressions of meeting the team and the sort of group mentality that they had. And I want to rewind to my first impressions of meeting the team, because I kind of met the core members of the team all at the same time, just many years before you did. So I just want to tell that story real quick, because it was a similar story for me. I had a client, I was an individual contractor living in Uruguay with my wife. I had come from doing business development and product management at startups, and before that, development in Denver. And so we were spending a year in Uruguay just for fun. And I got asked by my client, Taz, which no longer exists, unfortunately, but they asked me to go over to Argentina to hire a team, because there was some sort of, you know what, actually, I'll be very specific. Roshan Cholas, who is still on the team, was the sister-in-law of one of the founders of Taz. And she was moving to Argentina from San Diego to live there. She was going to marry Inti, and they're married to this day. And Inti was going to be the sort of seed member of a team in Argentina of technical people and of software developers for Taz. And they were going to do Flex, so Adobe Flex. And Kevin was like, John, go to Argentina and hire a team of Flex developers, because Roshan was a civil engineer and just really didn't have that skill set to be able to hire a team. So I flew from Montevideo to Resistencia, Argentina. And Inti had sort of put a position description into this university, this National Technical University in Resistencia, and said that I was available for doing interviews. And so the very first person I think I interviewed, maybe not the first person, but I think Federico Tucci was the first person I interviewed. And I was just like, whoa, cool. This guy's really enthusiastic, and He has the fundamentals needed to be a software developer. Of course, he doesn't know Flex, and like his work experience was like this awful, terrible Java program that he had been working on for some company or government entity. I mean, it was so bad. It was like, whoa, I have not seen a software looking this bad, since college, maybe. And then Fede got all of his friends to interview too. There's Teresa Higgins and Raul Herman and Rodrigo Bechara and Jonathan Diaz. So all of those people interviewed. Teresa is no longer with Kelsus because she moved to Ireland and is got a really cool job in Ireland working for one of the biggest conferences in the world. But everybody else, Johnny and Raul and Rodrigo, are still with us. And actually, I didn't choose Rodrigo at first. And I could tell, I was just like, whoa, this is really hurting Fede's feelings that I didn't pick Rodrigo. And it was a mistake because Rodrigo is one of our best people. I just wasn't seeing his like dedication and passion for software development come through in that interview. So I decided not to go with him. And Fede was like, no, Rodrigo is the best. You should hire him. And later we did. Anyway, that you just talked about how it was like, whoa, this group really seems to care about each other and really, sort of, I hesitate to say family because there's sort of like a negative connotation, especially in the US, of saying like your team is your family. Like that's against the rules in the US. Mm-hmm. But that's sort of the vibe I got, right? Like,
yeah, that's and like that's definitely the vibe that I got when meeting him in person in Uruguay. I mean, I'm just like little things. I would just blew me away. Like sitting at the dinner table and like someone noticing that someone's glass is not full with and refilling the water in their glass. Like that, I mean, just kind of like watching over each other, right? And just doing like, I mean, I don't know, that was just mind blowing to me.
Right on. So we've sort of established that there's this, different culture in Argentina in particular, and maybe even just in the northern part of Argentina, and maybe just with this particular group of people, right? But I think the key is that different places have different cultural aspects. But at the end of the day, there's still sort of a need to be a high-performing software development team, and that has specific requirements, right? Like there's certain things you have to do to be a high-performing software development team, or despite or because, your culture doesn't really matter to that. Like you still have to do those things.
Right. And it definitely wasn't all roses, right? Like coming into it. So it's like some of those initial impressions that I had of like the differences between like US based teams versus, international teams, was true. Right. So it's like, there were a lot of really great positive aspects that surprised me. So assets, strengths to be leveraged, but then also kind of looking at, the tools, the technologies, the processes that people were using to develop software. It definitely wasn't at the level that I was used to, right? So definitely some challenges there. It's like, okay, how do we level up, and how do we kind of marry the best of both worlds, right? Like become a high performing team without being a bunch of ego-centered jerks that are, in a dog eat dog world.
Right. And I want to get this point in too, because I think this underscores why we're even talking about this. It's been my experience, and it's our theory, I think, that time spent on a high-performing team is the best indicator of software skill. It's more than what university you went to. It's more than what your GitHub repository has in it. It's more than what Udacity and Udemy courses you've taken. In fact, those maybe even make you worse sometimes. Like the best indicator of whether somebody has a lot of skill in software is how much time they've spent on high-performing teams. Agreed, Chris?
I think it's definitely a very good indication, right? Because by nature, high-performing teams, like if someone is underperforming or is just not at the same level, they're going to get weeded out pretty quickly, right? So attrition will happen. So if you are part of a high-performing team and you stay there, it means that you're probably a valued contributor, and you're performing at that same level. And if you're not, right, if it was a hiring mistake or you're just not able to perform at that level, or kind of hiding behind other people's work, like people smell that, they know that. And then there's also like the resentment that comes into play too, right? So So yeah, absolutely. If you've joined a high performing team and then have actually stayed on that high performing team for some amount of time, that's a very, very good indication.
Right. So that's our theory. And then you come in and you see this group of people that loves working together, loves helping each other out. And essentially what you want to do is you want to apply what you've learned that high performing teams do to this team, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, okay. So at this point, we've laid the groundwork and we kind of know where you came from and what your expectations are. And it's just, I think that's been a fun story. I think what we should do is maybe finish off the story. If there's any other parts of the story that we should tell, and then maybe next week we can talk about, okay, enough story time. How do you make a high performing team?
No, I think we've kind of like covered the landscape there. I mean, it's just, again, the typical US based teams and kind of expectations there and kind of culture and like how folks work and kind of like this bias against offshore remote teams as being cheaper and quality not as high, kind of not capable of doing the heavier lifting type thing. And it definitely doesn't have to be that way. And at Kelsus, we've been fortunate to have leverage some of these strengths and assets that come from these remote international teams, and then have the mentoring, the coaching, the growth hacking, the growth mindset to level up, right, and become a high performing team and how do you do that? And we're still on that journey. We've come a long way.
Right.
And so we can get into some of the practicalities of that next time.
Yeah, I think let's do that. And in order to finish up story time, though, I think that there's one other story I want to tell to make one other point about high performing teams. And that's a story about how a small group of smart people over a short time can kind of produce just about as well as a high performing team without doing the right things. And so I want to tell a story about that because it's not the same. So this is sort of like a fake out high performing team. We worked with a team at Intel a few years ago, towards the end of 2015, beginning of 2016, to produce a musical experience for the keynote that Intel was giving at CES, the Consumer Electronics Showcase. So it's the biggest conference in the world, 600,000 attendees across like 20 hotels in Vegas. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's so big. And they were giving one of the keynotes. And I mean, I don't even know how many keynotes there were, if it was the main one or if there were like 500 keynotes. All I knew is it was Intel's keynote and it was like one of the first keynotes of the conference. So it felt important to me. And what I found when we joined that team is that they were basically a bunch of really smart people that were being driven by just like kind of an egocentrical leader who was just going to keep adding until it was too late to add anymore, right? Like that was his mentality. What can I squeeze into this thing? And how much more can I add to it until it's basically like, okay, showtime. And I was like, what is happening here? Like I think we did use like Git, but it wasn't even an Intel one. It was like some smart developer that I had worked with previously. It was like, we better use a repository. I was like, what? And then it was like, we had no communication, but that same developer was like, I just made my own personal Slack. We can talk on that. I was like, really? And then it was just like, let's add this lighting feature. Let's add this new configuration. Let's build a monitoring system. And like, we just kept being like, okay, all right, we'll just try to add it, and like layer and more features just getting added, and to the point where, in order to get the thing done, everybody had to stay in Las Vegas, fortunately at the Venetian, for 14 days leading up to CES, 14 days straight, and each of those 14 days, I think we worked at least 12 hours. Thank God, Kelsus was charging by the hour. And that was it. Like, it was Fede and me in Vegas trying our best to save the world and do heroics to get the thing done. And then in the end, it went off. I'm not going to say it went off without a hitch, but we did the performance, and the keynote was more or less a success. I think it would have been more successful with a little bit more discipline. But that is a surrogate for a high-performing team. It was a team of smart people that got a lot done in a very short amount of time with heroics. And what we're talking about when we talk about high-performing teams is not that. A high-performing team is able to sustain high performance, and you can only do what I just mentioned for a short time.
Yeah, and you're also rolling the dice, right? Like you're not going to be like in that particular case, it kind of worked out well, right? But it could have easily gone the other way and been a disaster.
Yes, exactly. So we'll talk more next week. This is, it's going to be sort of similar to some of the things we talked about that make a great software developer, but more specific to remote and independent developers, people that are out there on their own and doing this for Kelsus. So looking forward to that.
Absolutely. All right. See you next week.
Yeah, talk to you next week, Chris. Thanks.
Later.
Well, dear listener, you made it to the end. We appreciate your time and invite you to continue the conversation with us online. This episode, along with show notes and other valuable resources, is available at mobycast.fm/71. If you have any questions or additional insights, we encourage you to leave us a comment there. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.